In October 1775, the King of Britain prepared to travel through London to open Parliament. And somewhere in the nervous machinery of government, a terrifying idea took hold. What if George III never reached Westminster? What if, in the middle of his own capital, surrounded by soldiers, courtiers, crowds, and ceremony, the king was seized from his coach and carried away to the Tower of London? It sounded absurd. It sounded impossible. And yet, British officials treated it seriously enough to arrest an American-born radical on suspicion of high treason. Not in Boston, not in Philadelphia, in London, at the heart of the empire. To understand why this mattered, we have to slow the story down, because this was not simply a strange rumor about a kidnapped king. It was a moment when the American Revolution seemed to cross the Atlantic, enter the streets of London, and turn the capital's own imagination against itself. By the autumn of 1775, Britain was no longer arguing with its colonies in the comfortable language of petitions and complaints. Blood had already been shed in America. Rebellion had been proclaimed. Loyalty was no longer a private feeling. It was becoming a test, a suspicion, a question that could follow a man into a coffeehouse, a courtroom, or the Tower. And in that atmosphere, one name began to trouble the government: Stephen Sayre. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because the Sayre affair is not remembered today as a great turning point of the American Revolution. No king was captured. No mob stormed the palace. No hidden army rose in the streets. But that may be exactly why the story is so revealing. It shows us a government frightened not only by enemies abroad, but by uncertainty at home. And it begins on the road to Parliament, where ceremony, fear, and rumor briefly met in the same royal carriage. London was not an ocean away from the American Revolution. That is one of the easy mistakes to make when we picture 1775. We imagine the conflict unfolding in harbors, meeting houses, muddy roads outside Boston, and colonial assemblies where men argued themselves toward rebellion. Britain, in that picture, sits across the water like a distant command center, sending orders, ships, and soldiers into a problem that belonged somewhere else. But London was crowded with America, not America as a nation yet. Not even America as a single idea. It was there in fragments, in merchants who had built fortunes from Atlantic trade, in colonial agents who had spent years pleading their province's cases before ministries, in students, sailors, pamphleteers, debtors, exiles, and restless political men who had learned that London could be both a stage and a trap. Some had come to make money. Some had come to lobby. Some had come because the empire's largest city was where ambition naturally drifted. And some, by 1775, found themselves caught in the awkward position of being American, in a country now deciding whether Americans were subjects, rebels, or something dangerously in between. The city itself made that uncertainty worse. London was not a quiet imperial office with polished desks and tidy decisions. It was enormous, loud, impatient, and politically alive. Its coffeehouses were not merely places to drink coffee, though the coffee was probably punishment enough. They were rumor exchanges. A man could walk in with a letter from the colonies, an opinion about Parliament, or a complaint about the king's ministers, and within hours, the story might have changed shape 3 times. There were newspapers with sharp teeth. There were clubs and associations where reformers tested the limits of permissible speech. There were crowds capable of turning public feeling into physical pressure. There were memories of Wilkesite agitation, of city politics embarrassing the government, of Londoners treating royal authority not always with reverence, but sometimes with suspicion, mockery, and open defiance. So when the American crisis deepened, the British capital did not simply observe it, it absorbed it. The merchants worried about trade. The radicals saw an argument about liberty that looked uncomfortably familiar. Loyalists feared that hesitation would be mistaken for treason. Americans in London had to measure every conversation, because a political opinion that had once sounded bold might now sound incriminating. And this is where the story becomes more interesting than the simple phrase, American in London. Because there was no single American type in the city. There were colonists who remained loyal to the crown and regarded the rebellion as madness. There were others who sympathized with colonial grievances but did not necessarily dream of independence. There were men who enjoyed radical company, spoke in the language of constitutional liberty, and believed the king's ministers were pushing the empire toward disaster. There were also opportunists, self-inventors and political performers who understood that a crisis could make an ordinary man seem suddenly important. In a more stable moment, all of this might have been tolerated as the normal noise of imperial politics. London had always been full of arguments. It had survived pamphlet wars, factional fights, and public insults thrown at men far more powerful than the people throwing them. But 1775 was not stable. The violence in America changed the meaning of speech in Britain. A complaint could look like sympathy. Sympathy could look like collaboration. Collaboration could look like conspiracy. And once government officials began to think in those terms, the city became less like a capital and more like a map of possible threats. That is the atmosphere Stephen Sayre stepped into. He was not an invisible man murmuring in an alley. He moved within civic and political circles. He knew people. He understood London's radical language. And, crucially, he was American-born at a moment when that fact had stopped being a neutral biography. This is the detail that gives the affair its strange power. The fear was not that a foreign invader had slipped through the gates. The fear was that the empire's own networks, trade, migration, politics, conversation, had carried rebellion into the capital long before anyone knew what to call it. London was full of men who belonged to more than one world. And in a season of war that could look very much like danger, the British government did not need a completed conspiracy to become afraid. It needed a category. In late 1775, that category was rebellion. Once the Crown had formally declared the American colonies to be in a state of rebellion, the crisis changed its shape. It was no longer only a dispute about taxation, charters, or representation. It became a question of loyalty. And loyalty is always harder to measure than law. A law can be read. A tax can be counted. A regiment can be seen marching down a road. But loyalty lives in glances, letters, private dinners, unfinished sentences, and the dangerous confidence of men who think no one important is listening. The proclamation of rebellion helped create a new atmosphere in Britain. It did not simply announce that the colonies were in revolt. It encouraged vigilance. It invited subjects to assist in suppressing treasonable designs. In practice, that meant the public was being asked to watch, to report, to suspect. And suspicion is a strange political instrument. It can uncover real danger. It can also manufacture patterns from scattered noise. This is not to say the government's fear was imaginary. By October 1775, the conflict had already become violent. British authority in parts of America was collapsing or contested. Colonial resistance had moved beyond pamphlets and petitions. Men who had once called themselves loyal subjects were now taking up arms against the king's forces. From the government's point of view, that was not philosophy. It was war. But there was a problem with treating rebellion as a contagion. If rebellion could spread through print, conversation, correspondence, and sympathy, then it did not need an army to arrive in London. It could arrive as a letter folded into a coat pocket. It could arrive as a toast offered too loudly in a tavern. It could arrive as an American face in a London coffeehouse, speaking with unusual confidence about what the people might do if only someone gave them the signal. This is where ordinary public life began to look suspicious. A coffeehouse was no longer just a coffeehouse. It might be a meeting place. A political joke was no longer just a joke. It might be a test of allegiance. A man with colonial connections was no longer merely well-traveled. He might be part of a network. The machinery of fear does not always begin with secret police and locked doors. Sometimes it begins with a notice, a proclamation, a phrase repeated by officials until citizens learn to hear danger in one another. And London was especially vulnerable to that kind of hearing. The city had too many voices for the government to control. It had printers who lived by controversy, radicals who knew how to embarrass ministers, and crowds that could gather faster than authority could comfortably explain. There were old anxieties here, not all of them American. The fear of mob politics, of popular agitation, of London turning against the government from within, had been part of British political life long before the first shots of the Revolutionary War. The American crisis gave those anxieties a new mask. Now the radical was not only a nuisance, he might be a rebel's ally. The critic was not only disloyal in tone, he might be disloyal in action. The American was not only inconvenient, he might be dangerous. This is why the Sayre affair cannot be understood only by asking whether the alleged plot was real. That question matters, and it will return. But the deeper question is why the allegation was believable enough to move ministers, soldiers, and legal machinery into action. Governments reveal themselves by what they are prepared to believe. In October 1775, British officials were prepared to believe that the conflict in America could have sympathizers in the streets of London, that a dramatic strike against the king might be imagined, and that the safety of the monarch could no longer be treated as ceremonial routine. That belief did not emerge from nowhere. It was built from fear, recent violence, political pressure, and the uneasy knowledge that the empire's capital was not sealed off from the empire's rebellion. So when a report came forward naming an American-born man with radical connections, the government did not receive it in a calm room. It received it in a room already listening for treason. Stephen Sayre was exactly the kind of man a nervous government found difficult to ignore. He was American-born, but not provincial in the narrow sense. By the time his name entered the darker paperwork of 1775, he had already moved through worlds that usually stayed politely separated: commerce, city politics, radical company, transatlantic ambition. Sayre had a foot in each of them. That did not make him guilty of treason, but it did make him legible to officials as a particular type of threat: connected, articulate, restless, and difficult to place. He was not a soldier of the Continental cause in London, marching under a flag. He was not a spy in the clean, fictional sense, with a cipher in one pocket and a poison ring in the other. The truth appears less theatrical and more dangerous to authority. Sayre belonged to the murky social territory, where politics moved through relationships. He knew men who disliked the ministry. He associated with circles shaped by reformist and radical ideas. He had ties to John Wilkes, whose name still carried a charge in London political life. Wilkes was not merely a person to officials. He was a reminder that the capital could mock, resist, and embarrass power in public. Sayre's position made the matter stranger still. He had served as High Sheriff of the City of London, a civic role that placed him within the formal life of the capital. This was not some anonymous American stranger appearing at the edge of a crisis. He had been close enough to London's institutions to understand their rhythms, their ceremonies, and perhaps their vulnerabilities. That is one reason the accusation against him struck such an uneasy chord. A threat from outside can be imagined simply. A French agent, a smuggled weapon, a hostile fleet. These are the kinds of dangers governments know how to describe. But Sayre represented something harder to name. He was part of the imperial system that Britain itself had created. He was an American shaped by British commerce, British politics, British civic culture. If he had become dangerous, then the danger had not merely invaded London. It had grown inside the connections that held the empire together. This is where we have to be careful. It is tempting, especially from the distance of later history, to turn Sayre into a hidden revolutionary mastermind. The American Revolution gives every American radical in London a kind of retrospective glow, as if each of them must have been quietly serving the future republic before the future republic fully existed. But people rarely live inside history as neatly as they appear inside summaries. Sayre seems to have been ambitious, politically engaged, and attracted to causes larger than himself. He may also have been imprudent. Those qualities can look heroic in one telling and reckless in another. In the Sayre affair, they made him vulnerable because the government did not need to prove that he commanded an army of conspirators in order to fear him. It only needed to believe that he might be a connector, a man through whom American grievance, London radicalism, and public disorder could touch. That possibility mattered more than his actual power. The alleged plot that would soon be attached to his name was so dramatic that it almost overshadows the man himself. The king intercepted, the Tower seized, London unsettled, perhaps even the monarchy humiliated before Europe. But before all that, there was only a profile forming in official minds. American, radical, well-connected, too close to the city's political nerves. It was a dangerous combination in a season when the government had begun to treat uncertainty as a form of evidence. And Sayre, whether by conviction, temperament, or simple misfortune, stood in precisely the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. The story now narrows to a room, not a battlefield, not a ministry, not the floor of Parliament, a coffee house. In 18th century London, this was not a minor setting. Coffee houses were where information went to become unstable. News arrived there half-confirmed, letters were read aloud, reputations were made and damaged, and men who considered themselves important could speak with the confidence of men who had not yet been contradicted by events. The place named in the Sayre affair was the Pennsylvania Coffee House. Even the name carries a kind of historical irony. Pennsylvania, in London, was not just a colony on a map. It was a commercial connection, a political reference, a doorway through which colonial news and colonial people passed into metropolitan conversation. According to the accusation that reached the government, Stephen Sayre spoke there with Lieutenant Francis Richardson. Here, the floor under the story becomes less solid. The alleged conversation depends heavily on Richardson's report. That does not mean it was false. It means we have to listen with caution. A conversation remembered after the fact, especially one reported in a climate of political fear, is not the same thing as a signed manifesto. Words can be sharpened by memory. Jokes can be mistaken for plans. Boasts can become confessions. And in a city already prepared to hear treason, even a foolish sentence could acquire the weight of a conspiracy. But the claim was extraordinary. Sayre, Richardson alleged, had spoken of a plan to intercept George III on his way to the state opening of Parliament. The king's coach would be stopped. The monarch would be carried to the Tower of London. From there, the plot would supposedly widen into a political rupture, a seizure of symbolic power, perhaps even a signal for popular unrest. That is the version that alarmed officials. And it is worth pausing over just how strange it is. The Tower was not merely a prison. It was a fortress with a deep symbolic charge, a place where the authority of monarchy, violence, memory, and state punishment overlapped. To imagine the king taken there was to imagine a reversal of power almost too theatrical to be practical. The king, who ruled in law, confined within one of his own royal strongholds. The state turned against itself in a single movement through London streets. It has the quality of political fantasy. But political fantasies can still be dangerous. They reveal what people think power is made of. Sayre, if he said anything like this, may have imagined that monarchy depended not only on armies and laws, but on public confidence. Interrupt the ceremony, humiliate the king, startle the capital, force the people to choose whether they feared authority or despised it. That is a theory of revolution by spectacle. Whether Sayre truly held that theory, whether he merely blustered, whether Richardson misunderstood him, or whether the conversation was later shaped to sound more organized than it had been, remains uncertain. The details are dependent on Richardson's account and must be treated as unverified. Still, the allegation had force because it joined several fears into one image. The king's public route through the city, the crowds that always gathered around ceremony, the presence of Americans in London, the memory of radical agitation, the possibility that the American rebellion might find an echo in the British capital. A plot does not need to be realistic to be frightening. Sometimes it only needs to connect the anxieties already waiting in the room. And if the Pennsylvania coffeehouse conversation happened even roughly as reported, it placed Stephen Sayre in the most dangerous position available to a political talker in 1775. A man whose words could be read not as opinion, not as bravado, but as the outline of high treason. The government would soon act as though the danger was real. But before that could happen, someone had to decide that a conversation over coffee belonged not to gossip, but to the crown. Francis Richardson was American by origin and loyalist by action. That combination matters. In stories about revolutions, we often prefer clean divisions, patriots on one side, loyalists on the other, a line drawn across the map or across the heart, and everyone forced into the category that later history remembers best. But in 1775, identity was not clean. It was unsettled, personal, and often painfully practical. Richardson's life placed him in that unsettled space. He was an American serving in the British Army, a man whose birthplace connected him to the colonies, but whose uniform connected him to the crown. In another context, that might have been an ordinary imperial career. The British Empire was full of such crossings. Men served far from where they were born. Families stretched across oceans. Loyalty was not always assumed to follow geography. But war changes the meaning of origin. Once rebellion began, an American in British service became something more complicated than a soldier. He became a living argument against the idea that America spoke with one voice. His existence unsettled the simple revolutionary story just as much as it reassured the British one. Here was proof, or so loyalists might say, that colonial birth did not require colonial rebellion. And then came the conversation with Stephen Sayre. Richardson had a choice. He could dismiss what he heard as reckless talk. He could warn Sayre privately to be less foolish. He could repeat the story socially, as men often did in a city hungry for political scandal. Or he could carry it upward into the channels of military and government authority. He chose the crown. That decision is easy to flatten into betrayal or duty, depending on which flag one prefers. But the more interesting point is that Richardson's report became the bridge between rumor and state action. Without him, the alleged coffeehouse conversation might have remained one more dangerous bit of London noise, exaggerated by listeners, softened by denials, and lost among the daily arguments of wartime politics. By reporting Sayre, Richardson transformed speech into evidence. Not strong evidence, necessarily. Not complete evidence. But evidence in the only form the government needed at that moment. A named informant, a named suspect, and a claim involving the king's physical safety. This is why Richardson is more than a supporting figure. He embodies the divided colonial identity that made the whole affair possible. If a London radical had accused Sayre, the story might have looked like factional politics. If a ministerial spy had produced it, critics would have suspected manipulation from the beginning. But Richardson was American too. His colonial origin gave the report a particular flavor. He could be presented not as a panicked outsider misunderstanding colonial talk, but as someone close enough to recognize its danger. That does not prove he was right. It means his identity helped make the accusation usable. There is also a quieter human dimension here. Imagine the pressure of hearing something that might be treason in a city where the government had already asked loyal subjects to be alert. To stay silent was not neutral. Silence could later be interpreted as complicity. If Sayre's alleged scheme had even a fragment of reality behind it, Richardson's failure to report might have ruined him. Fear works on informants too. So he acted, and once he acted, the story no longer belonged to the coffeehouse. It moved into a colder world of offices, warrants, examinations, and political consequences. Sayre's words, whatever their original tone, were now detached from the table where they had been spoken and placed before men whose job was to imagine the worst. This is one of the uncomfortable patterns of wartime societies. The state depends on citizens to warn it of danger. But every warning arrives already shaped by memory, motive, fear, and self-protection. A report may be honest and still misleading. It may be exaggerated and still contain something true. It may save a life. It may destroy one. Richardson chose to report. And in doing so, he placed the British government in a position where inaction itself could look like negligence. The next decision would not be made in a coffeehouse by an American soldier. It would be made by a minister responsible for the security of the realm, staring at an accusation that was either ridiculous, explosive, or both. Lord Rochford's problem was not that he knew too little. It was that he knew just enough to be afraid. As Secretary of State, Rochford was responsible for domestic security at a moment when domestic security had become a much wider idea than guarding doors and watching ports. The American crisis had stretched the imagination of danger. A threat might be military, political, printed, whispered, or hidden inside ordinary civic life. And now a report had arrived, suggesting that the king himself might be targeted on the road to Parliament. For a minister, this was the kind of accusation that punishes hesitation. Ignore it, and if anything happens, your caution becomes incompetence. Act on it, and if the evidence collapses, your vigilance becomes tyranny. There is no comfortable middle ground when the alleged victim is the monarch and the alleged crime is treason. Rochford had to make a decision inside that pressure. We should not picture him as a cartoon villain rubbing his hands over a convenient excuse. That is too easy and probably too neat. Governments often do oppressive things not because every official is theatrical in his malice, but because fear gives bad judgment, the appearance of responsibility. The safer choice, from inside the office, may be the more dangerous choice for everyone outside it. To Rochford, the report had several qualities that made it hard to dismiss. It named a suspect. It came through military channels. It involved the king's public movement through London. And the suspect was not a random drunk shouting in the street, but Stephen Sayre, American-born, politically connected, and already close enough to radical London to seem plausible in the role the accusation required. That last word matters. Plausible. Not proven. Plausible. Much of political security turns on that difference. Proof is slow. Plausibility is immediate. Proof demands corroboration, context, patience. Plausibility asks a more urgent question. Can you afford to be wrong? In October 1775, Rochford apparently decided that he could not. The timing made the report more combustible. The state opening of Parliament was not a private errand. It was public theater with constitutional meaning. The king's movement through the capital was part ceremony, part message, sovereign, parliament, and empire continuing in their appointed order. Any disruption along that route would be more than a physical danger. It would be humiliation staged before the city, and humiliation can frighten governments almost as much as violence. If the king were merely threatened in secret, officials could manage the story. But an attempted seizure in the streets would belong instantly to rumor, press, crowd, and opposition politics. Every version would spread before the government could control it. Every witness would become a publisher. Every enemy of the ministry would find meaning in the chaos. So Rochford faced not only the possibility of an attack, but the possibility of public disorder around the idea of an attack. That is why the alleged Sayre plot struck at a nerve deeper than personal safety. It imagined the king as vulnerable in his own capital. It imagined London not as the secure heart of empire, but as a place where American grievance and British radicalism might join hands long enough to embarrass the crown. Whether such a thing was actually possible is another question. In fact, the plot as later described would appear almost fantastically impractical. It depended on coordination, secrecy, crowd behavior, access, nerve, and political momentum. All the things that conspiracies require and rarely possess in the correct amount. But before a plot is tested by reality, it exists in the mind as a risk. And risks grow larger in offices where no one wants to be remembered as the man who dismissed the warning. Rochford's alarm was therefore both understandable and revealing. Understandable because a minister charged with security could hardly shrug at a report concerning the king's route. Revealing because the speed and seriousness of the response show how deeply the American rebellion had unsettled Britain's ruling imagination. The empire was fighting a war across the Atlantic, but its ministers were now listening for the sound of that war in London coffeehouses. The question was no longer simply, what are the Americans doing in America? It had become, what are the Americans doing here? Once that question enters a government's mind, the city changes shape. A civic officer becomes a suspect. A conversation becomes a plot. A ceremony becomes a vulnerability. The road to Parliament becomes a corridor of possible treason. And somewhere in that transformation, Stephen Sayre's fate was decided. Not by a trial, not by proof, but by an official calculation that the danger of waiting was greater than the danger of acting too soon. On the morning of October 23rd, 1775, Stephen Sayre's life crossed the invisible line between suspicion and imprisonment. Until then, he had been a troublesome figure in the political imagination of the government, a name in reports, a man discussed in offices, an American with dangerous associations and perhaps even more dangerous conversation. But a suspicion, however alarming, still leaves a person in the world of ordinary movement. He can wake in his own rooms. He can answer his own door. He can believe that words, if denied firmly enough, will remain only words. Then the state arrives. Sayre was arrested on suspicion of high treason. That phrase carries a heaviness no modern summary quite captures. Treason was not simply a severe legal accusation. It was the crime that imagined the subject turned against the sovereign at the most fundamental level. To be accused of it was to be placed outside the ordinary quarrels of politics. It meant the government was no longer treating you as an opponent, a critic, a nuisance, or even a radical. It was treating you as a possible enemy of the king. His papers were searched. That detail may sound administrative, but it is one of the most intimate acts a government can perform without violence. Papers are where a public man's private architecture lives. Letters, names, drafts, debts, friendships, careless phrases, half-formed ideas. A search does not merely look for evidence. It rearranges a life into possible incriminations. One can imagine the officials hoping to find the missing piece that would make everything solid. A list of conspirators, a plan of the king's route, correspondence with American rebels, some fatal scrap that transformed Richardson's report from alarming testimony into the entrance hall of a wider plot. But the search did not produce the dramatic proof that fear had promised. Sayre denied the accusation. He would continue to deny it. And yet denial, once treason has been spoken aloud by authority, has a difficult journey back to innocence. The government had already acted. The arrest itself became part of the story. If ministers were wrong, they had not made a small mistake. They had seized a man of civic standing in the capital and sent a public message that conspiracy had reached London. Sayre was committed to the Tower of London. There is almost too much symbolism in that sentence. The alleged plan had involved taking the king to the Tower. Instead, the accused conspirator was taken there himself. The reversal has the neatness of theater, except it was happening to a real man, under real guards, inside a fortress whose walls had absorbed centuries of political fear. The Tower was not only a place, it was an argument made in stone. It told the city that power could still lock a body away. It carried memories of noble prisoners, failed rebellions, religious conflicts, dynastic threats, and the long, uneasy relationship between government security and personal liberty. By 1775, it was not the daily machinery of punishment it had once been, but that made its use more conspicuous, not less. To send Sayre there was to elevate the affair. It made the accusation visible. It gave rumor a monument. And this is where the government's position began to become dangerous in a different way. Arresting a suspected traitor can project strength, but if the case remains thin, that same arrest begins to look like panic wearing official clothing. Every hour Sayre remained in custody without public proof invited another question. Had ministers uncovered a revolutionary cell, or had they frightened themselves into imprisoning a man for political talk? The distinction mattered deeply in Britain. The country that was fighting American rebels in the name of lawful authority also prided itself on liberties at home. Warrants, imprisonment, executive power, the rights of the subject. These were not abstract issues. They were living political weapons, especially in London, where the press and opposition knew exactly how to turn ministerial overreach into scandal. So the Tower did not end the Sayre affair. It intensified it. Inside the fortress, Sayre became more than the man accused of a plot. He became a test case for the government's judgment. If evidence emerged, the arrest would seem prudent, even heroic. If evidence failed, the prisoner would become proof that the ministry had confused anxiety with law. And outside the Tower, London continued to breathe, talk, exaggerate, laugh, and listen. The king's journey to Parliament still approached. The city still contained radicals, loyalists, Americans, informers, and printers hungry for the next version of the story. Officials had acted to prevent a possible danger, but in doing so, they had created a public drama of their own. They had opened the gates of the Tower. Now they had to justify why. The alleged plot, when laid out plainly, has the unsettling quality of a plan designed by someone who understood symbols better than logistics. At its center was the king's coach. That image mattered. George III, traveling to the state opening of Parliament, was not merely a man moving through London traffic, though London traffic has never been kind to anyone, royal or otherwise. It was a public ritual. The monarch's body, the royal carriage, the route, the guards, the watching crowds, all of it formed part of a political performance. Britain was showing itself to itself. The king would pass through the capital and arrive before Parliament. The machinery of government would continue. The empire, despite rebellion in America, would appear orderly and whole. The alleged conspiracy imagined interrupting that performance at its most visible point. According to the accusation, Sayre's supposed design involved stopping the royal coach, seizing George III, and taking him to the Tower of London. From there, the story becomes even more extraordinary. The Tower, with its arms and its old authority, would become the center of a rupture. The arsenal would be controlled. The London mob would be stirred or summoned. The king might then be removed from Britain altogether, perhaps sent to Hanover, as though the political problem of monarchy could be solved by returning the monarch to his German inheritance. Even as an allegation, it feels almost too crowded with meaning. There is the king, captured in public. There is the Tower, turned from royal fortress into revolutionary stage. There is the arsenal, suggesting not merely protest, but armed force. There is the London crowd, imagined as a sleeping giant that only needed waking. And there is Hanover, the old dynastic connection, used almost like a punchline with treason attached. Send the king away, and let Britain discover what it is without him. If this was a real plan, it was breathtakingly bold. If it was fantasy, it was still revealing, because the fantasy itself shows what frightened people in power. The government feared not simply that one man might attack the king. It feared that ceremony could be broken, that the city might not respond obediently, that the monarch's dignity might depend on public consent more than anyone wished to admit. Yet when we look at the mechanics, the alleged scheme begins to sag under its own theatrical weight. How would the conspirators stop the coach? With how many men? At what exact point on the route? How would they overcome guards before alarm spread? How would they move the king through London without immediate resistance? How would they secure the Tower, control its arsenal, and persuade soldiers or officers not to oppose them? How would a crowd, even an angry one, be converted into a disciplined political force at the precise moment required? And perhaps most important, who exactly was prepared to do all this? That is where the story becomes thinner. A conspiracy of this scale requires more than anger. It requires organization. It requires money, secrecy, weapons, timing, trusted participants, and a shared belief that success is possible. The alleged Sayre plot, as it came down through the accusations, seems to offer more dramatic imagery than practical infrastructure. This does not mean nothing was said. It does not mean Sayre was innocent of foolish talk. It does not mean Richardson invented every word. The historical caution here cuts in both directions. People in revolutionary moments do say reckless things. They imagine impossible actions before anyone has tested them against reality. They mistake the heat of political conversation for the temperature of the street. But the distance between saying a king could be seized and actually seizing a king is enormous. That distance is where the Sayre affair lives. Contemporaries, too, had reasons to doubt. The alleged plan seemed improbable not because George III was untouchable in some mystical sense, but because London was complicated, guarded, noisy, and politically unpredictable. The city might riot, yes. It might mock authority, gather in crowds, and trouble ministers. But a crowd is not the same thing as a conspiracy. Public anger is not automatically a chain of command. The government's fear depended on imagining that all these unstable elements could align. An American radical, London reformers, armed force, civic unrest, and a vulnerable royal procession. That alignment was possible enough to frighten officials, but perhaps too perfect to be believable. And that may be the most important point. The alleged Sayre plot was not powerful because it was likely to succeed. It was powerful because it compressed the empire's anxieties into one unforgettable scene. A rebellion that began across the Atlantic would suddenly appear in the road before the king's horses. The colonies would not need to defeat Britain in a formal battle. They would only need to make Britain doubt the security of its own capital. This is why absurd stories can have real consequences. A ridiculous plot, believed by serious men, can open prisons. It can damage reputations. It can change political debate. It can make a government reveal what it fears most. And in October 1775, the British state looked at the road to Parliament and briefly saw not a ceremony, but a trap. John Wilkes did not need to be guilty of anything in 1775 to be useful to fear. His name already carried its own weather. For years, Wilkes had been one of the great irritants of British politics. A radical politician, a defender of popular liberties in the eyes of his admirers, and a dangerous demagogue in the eyes of his enemies. He had made himself into more than a man. He had become a symbol of resistance to ministerial power, of the unruly independence of the City of London, of crowds that did not always know when to stop cheering, shouting, or breaking windows. By the time the Sayre affair erupted, Wilkes was not simply a person officials could evaluate calmly. He was a memory with a pulse. And that mattered because Stephen Sayre moved in a London where Wilkesite politics still shaped the government's imagination of disorder. The capital had already shown that it could rally around a figure who challenged authority and turn legal controversy into street politics. The cry of Wilkes and liberty had once made the government look clumsy, vindictive, and afraid. Ministers had learned a lesson from that experience, though perhaps not the lesson Wilkes's supporters would have preferred. They had learned that London radicalism could embarrass power in public. So when Sayre was accused of plotting against the king, any connection, social, political, ideological, or rumored, to Wilkes's world made the allegation feel more combustible. It suggested that the supposed danger might not be isolated. It might have roots in a city already experienced in defiance. But here we have to draw the line carefully. There were claims that Wilkes had approved or encouraged the plan. That claim remains uncertain. It should not be treated as fact. The evidence is too thin to turn Wilkes into a proven conspirator in a scheme to seize George III. To do so would be to let the government's fear write the verdict for us. What we can say with more confidence is that Wilkes's shadow changed how the affair was perceived. That shadow was large enough. For officials, the thought may have gone something like this. If an American radical had spoken of seizing the king, and if that radical had links to the city's reformist and anti-ministerial circles, then perhaps the plot was not merely American. Perhaps it was London's old radical energy finding a new cause in America's rebellion. This was the nightmare version. Not a few angry colonists, not a handful of reckless talkers, but a fusion of grievances. American resistance abroad, Wilkesite defiance at home, city politics, popular crowds, and the symbolic vulnerability of the king's procession. In that imagined fusion, Wilkes did not have to sign a document. He did not have to attend a secret meeting. His political reputation alone helped officials picture a London where the crowd might side against the ministry, or at least hesitate long enough for chaos to do its work. That is one of the stranger forms of political power. To become so strongly associated with disorder in the minds of your enemies that your name can intensify a conspiracy even without proof of your participation. Wilkes was useful in another way too. He made the Sayre affair legible to the press and the public. If the government portrayed the arrest as necessary security, opponents could read it through a different history. A ministry once again overreaching, once again confusing criticism with treason. once again trying to frighten the country into obedience. This was not a small distinction. In Britain, especially in London, liberty was not only an American slogan, it was a domestic political language with its own heroes, grudges, and legal traditions. When the government moved against Sayre, it did so in a city trained to ask whether ministers were protecting the state or protecting themselves from embarrassment. Wilkes's presence in the background sharpened that question. The Sayre affair therefore sits at an intersection that is easy to miss. It was not merely about America. It was not merely about George III. It was also about the unresolved tension inside Britain between authority and reform, order and public criticism, security and liberty. The American Revolution did not create that tension. It gave it a new costume. To frightened ministers, radical London looked like dry tinder waiting for a colonial spark. To critics of the government, the arrest of Sayre looked like proof that ministers were willing to call any spark a fire if it justified a show of force. And Wilkes, whether conspirator, bystander, or convenient specter, stood near the center of that argument as the man whose political life had already taught both sides how dramatic a quarrel over liberty could become. This is why his shadow matters more than any unproven allegation of approval. The Sayre affair was built not only from evidence, but from associations: a coffeehouse, an American, a procession, a tower, a radical circle, a name that still made ministers uncomfortable. In calmer times, those pieces might have remained separate. In October 1775, fear arranged them into a pattern. There is a point in this story where the evidence stops behaving like a road and starts behaving like fog. You can still see shapes inside it: a coffeehouse, a report, a minister alarmed, a warrant, a prisoner in the tower. But the harder you try to measure the distance between those shapes, the more uncertain the scene becomes. Was there truly a revolutionary cell in London planning to seize George III? Or was there only a dangerous conversation, overheard by a nervous soldier and inflated by a frightened government? Or something even stranger, a boast, a misunderstanding, a trap, a political farce that acquired the costume of treason because everyone involved had something to fear? This is the heart of the Sayre affair, and the honest answer is that we cannot close the case with perfect confidence. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. In a more satisfying drama, there would be a hidden document discovered in a locked drawer, a list of names, a second witness, a confession whispered too late, something solid enough to let us point and say, "There, that is what really happened." But the Sayre affair refuses that kind of neatness. The government behaved as though the danger was immediate and grave. Yet the alleged plot, when examined practically, looked wildly improbable. The public was told to imagine a conspiracy capable of stopping the king's coach, controlling the tower, manipulating London crowds, and perhaps reshaping the monarchy itself. But where were the men? Where were the weapons? Where was the organization strong enough to turn coffeehouse words into a political coup? The gap between official panic and visible evidence was enormous. That gap is where skepticism rushed in. To some observers, the whole affair looked less like a narrowly avoided catastrophe than a ministry embarrassing itself. Sayre could be portrayed not as a mastermind, but as a convenient victim of wartime paranoia. The government, already anxious about Americans and radicals, had heard what it expected to hear and acted before the facts could bear the weight placed upon them. There is a familiar pattern here. When governments are afraid, they often become skilled at connecting dots. Sometimes the dots are real. Sometimes they are arranged into a picture that tells us more about the government's imagination than about the accused man's intentions. In Sayre's case, almost every element had a double meaning. His American birth could mean colonial connection or colonial threat. His radical associations could mean political principle or conspiratorial access. His civic position could mean respectability or dangerous proximity to power. His alleged words could mean treason or bravado or bait or foolishness. Even Richardson's report sits uneasily between duty and uncertainty. Perhaps he heard something genuinely alarming and acted as any loyal officer should. Perhaps he misunderstood a reckless political fantasy. Perhaps he repeated the story with details sharpened by fear. None of these possibilities requires him to be a liar. History is full of honest men who report what they think they heard. And in moments of crisis, what they think they heard can become very powerful. Sayre himself denied the charge. But denial alone cannot settle the matter either. Innocent men deny charges. Guilty men deny them too. What matters is what could be proved, and proof was exactly what the affair struggled to produce. This is why calling it simply a terror cell would distort the evidence. That phrase belongs to a modern vocabulary and suggests an organization more definite than the record can support. But calling it only a farce may also go too far. People in 1775 were living through a real imperial crisis. The American Rebellion was not imaginary. Radical London was not a fantasy. Public disorder was not unknown. The government's fear had roots in actual instability, even if the Sayre case itself may have been inflated. The affair sits between those poles. It was not nothing, but it may not have been what ministers feared. That middle space is often where the most revealing history lives, not in the clean victory of truth over rumor or rumor over truth, but in the messy process by which rumor becomes action. Think of what had to happen for Stephen Sayre to end up in the Tower. A conversation had to be remembered as dangerous. A report had to be believed. A minister had to judge the risk unacceptable. The legal machinery had to move. The symbolic weight of treason had to fall on one man before the public could see the evidence for itself. Every step was a choice, and each choice was made in an atmosphere already shaped by war. That atmosphere does not excuse the government if it overreached, but it helps explain why overreach could feel, from inside the office, like prudence. This is one of the darker lessons of the affair. Fear rarely announces itself as fear. It usually arrives dressed as responsibility. A minister does not say, "I am panicking." He says, "I am protecting the king." An informer does not say, "I may have misunderstood." He says, "I thought it my duty to report." A public critic does not say, "I know for certain there was no danger." He says, "Show us the evidence." And somewhere between those statements, a man is locked in the Tower. The Sayre affair became controversial precisely because it touched that nerve. It forced Britons to ask how much power the state should have when it claims to see a threat the public cannot yet verify. It asked whether liberty could survive a politics of suspicion. It asked whether wartime security made ministers wiser or merely more dangerous. The remarkable thing is not that the government feared a plot. The remarkable thing is how quickly the fear itself became the central evidence. And once that happened, the question changed. It was no longer only whether Stephen Sayre had planned the impossible. It was whether Britain, in trying to defend itself against rebellion, was beginning to behave like a country haunted by its own doubts. The arrest did not stay where the government wanted it. That was the difficulty with London. Ministers could sign warrants, search papers, and send a man to the Tower, but they could not easily control what the city made of it afterward. A security action, once visible, became public property. It entered coffeehouses, print shops, taverns, private letters, and the sharp little conversations that make authority feel much less grand than it looks on paper. And parts of the London press did not treat the Sayre affair with reverence. They mocked it. That mockery mattered. It was not just laughter at the idea of a bizarre conspiracy. It was political laughter, the kind that strips official language of its armor. A government may describe an arrest as a necessary act of vigilance. A newspaper can ask, with a raised eyebrow, whether the ministry has discovered treason or merely frightened itself with a ghost story. The alleged plot gave satirists and opposition voices plenty to work with. The king seized from his coach, the Tower captured, the arsenal controlled. The London mob somehow transformed into a disciplined revolutionary instrument. George III perhaps packed off toward Hanover like an unwanted parcel from a dynastic warehouse. Even in a century not short on political absurdity, this was rich material. But beneath the ridicule was a serious argument. If the government could arrest a man of standing on such uncertain grounds, what did that say about the liberty of the subject? If high treason could grow out of a reported conversation, how safe was political speech in wartime? If ministers could invoke the king's safety to justify swift imprisonment, who would decide when fear had become an excuse? These questions cut deeply because Britain was not fighting the American Revolution in a moral vacuum. British officials insisted that lawful authority had to be preserved against rebellion. But critics could reply that lawful authority did not mean arbitrary power. A state could defend order and still be judged by the methods it used. In that sense, Sayre's arrest became more than a strange episode. It became a mirror held up to Britain's own claims about itself. The empire was accusing Americans of rebellion against constitutional government. Yet here, in the capital, the government seemed willing to treat suspicion as sufficient reason to throw an American-born radical into the Tower. To opposition writers, that looked less like confidence and more like panic. And panic, when it wears a ministerial seal, can become dangerous very quickly. The press did what the press often does in moments like this. It changed the emotional temperature of the story. At first, the allegation had invited fear. What if the king had truly been in danger? What if rebels and radicals had plotted violence in the very streets of London? What if the American war had already reached the capital in secret? But mockery invited a different response. What if the government had overreached? What if the supposed conspiracy was so implausible that only frightened ministers could believe it? What if the Tower had not exposed a treasonous network, but revealed the nervousness of the men who sent Sayre there? That shift was politically damaging. Fear isolates the accused. Ridicule isolates the accuser. Once the affair became laughable, Rochford and the ministry faced a problem. They had to show that the danger had been real enough to justify the drama. It was no longer enough to say that they had acted responsibly. The public wanted substance, names, weapons, documents, a conspiracy with more flesh on it than one reported conversation. And the more the evidence failed to appear, the more the press could turn the government's seriousness against it. This is one reason authoritarian gestures often age badly in public. At the moment of action, they can seem decisive. Later, under scrutiny, they may look theatrical, insecure, even ridiculous. The Tower, meant to signal the gravity of the threat, could also make the government look as though it had dragged an old instrument of state intimidation into a case too flimsy to deserve it. London understood that symbolism. The city had a long memory for struggles over warrants, imprisonment, and ministerial abuse. It knew how to speak the language of rights. It knew how to turn a prisoner into an argument. Sayre was not universally beloved, and not everyone would have accepted his innocence. But the issue did not require affection for Sayre. It required suspicion of power. That is a very different political emotion. A man can be personally foolish and still be wrongfully treated. He can be radical, vain, indiscreet, or irritating, and still become the occasion for a legitimate public defense of civil liberty. In fact, such cases often test liberty most sharply, because governments rarely overreach against universally cherished saints. They move first against people who are already easy to dislike. Sayre, with his American birth and radical associations, was vulnerable in exactly that way. The newspapers that mocked the affair were therefore doing something more subtle than defending one man. They were questioning a wartime habit of mind, the assumption that danger, once named by authority, should be accepted before it is proved. That habit is powerful. It asks the public to trust the unseen, trust the report, trust the minister, trust the sealed papers, trust the urgency, trust that liberty must briefly step aside because the government knows more than it can safely say. Sometimes that trust is justified. Sometimes it is not. The Sayre affair forced London to sit with the difference. And because the evidence remained uncertain, the story became a contest between two kinds of imagination. The government imagined hidden treason. The press imagined hidden abuse. Each side accused the other of being dangerously naive. In the middle stood Stephen Sayre, no longer merely a suspect, but a symbol being pulled in opposite directions. To ministers, he represented the frightening possibility that American rebellion had allies inside Britain. To critics, he represented the equally frightening possibility that Britain, in suppressing rebellion, might begin to betray the liberties it claimed to defend. That is why the newspapers struck back so sharply. They understood that the strangest part of the story was not the alleged plan to seize the king. It was the speed with which fear could make such a plan seem credible enough to imprison a man. And once that realization entered print, the government's advantage began to fade. The day of the state opening arrived with the peculiar tension of an event that had already been imagined going wrong. That is the thing about a threatened ceremony. Even if nothing happens, the threat changes the way the ceremony is seen. The route is no longer just a route. The crowd is no longer just a crowd. Every pause in movement can feel loaded. Every face near the carriage becomes, for a moment, part of a question no one can comfortably answer. George III passed safely. No coach was seized. No armed band appeared. No revolutionary signal passed through the streets. The Tower did not become the headquarters of an uprising. The arsenal was not captured. The London crowd did not transform into a disciplined force of rebellion. The king reached Parliament, and the constitutional theater continued. On the surface, that should have vindicated the government's vigilance. After all, nothing had happened. Ministers could always say that prevention is invisible when it succeeds. A danger stopped in time leaves no dramatic wreckage behind. No broken carriage, no wounded guards, no terrified monarch dragged through the city. In matters of security, absence can be made to sound like proof. But the Sayre affair had a problem. The absence was too complete. There was no uprising, no visible cell, no captured stockpile of weapons, no chain of conspirators revealed by the search of papers, no sudden confession from frightened accomplices, no second act that made the first act seem wise. The king's safe passage did not close the controversy. It sharpened it. Because if the plot had been as serious as the arrest suggested, where was the rest of it? This is where official security and public reasoning often part company. To a minister, the safe arrival of the king might confirm that rapid action prevented disaster. To skeptics, the same safe arrival might confirm that there had been no disaster to prevent. The facts did not speak for themselves. They had to be interpreted, and in London, interpretation was a crowded profession. The state opening therefore became a strange kind of anticlimax. In a more conventional conspiracy story, this is the point where the hidden danger reveals itself. The assassins step forward. The crowd surges. A signal is given. History tears open in the street. But here, The carriage rolled on, and that quiet continuation was devastating in its own way. It left the government holding an arrested man and an enormous accusation, but without the public evidence needed to satisfy a city already laughing at the affair. The more normal the ceremony appeared, the stranger the government's alarm seemed in retrospect. This does not mean officials had invented their concern from nothing. They may genuinely have believed they had prevented an attempt. Richardson's report may have seemed credible to them. Sayre's connections may have made the accusation feel urgent. The political climate was tense, and a minister responsible for the king's safety had little incentive to gamble on calm. But once the feared day passed, responsibility changed form. Before the ceremony, Rochford could act under the pressure of possibility. Afterward, he had to defend the consequences of action. That is a harder task. Possibility can be vague. Consequences have names. Stephen Sayre was one of those names. He remained the man who had been accused, searched, and imprisoned. He remained the man around whom the government had built a frightening picture of treason. And now, with the king safe and the capital unshaken, the pressure shifted from preventing a plot to proving that the plot had ever deserved such treatment. This is one of the cruel paradoxes of security politics. If danger materializes, the state is judged for whether it was prepared. If danger does not materialize, the state is judged for whether it imagined too much. The same officials who are praised for vigilance in one version of events can be condemned for hysteria in another. Rochford had chosen to act as though the worst might be true. Now the public wanted to know why. The safe passage of George III also exposed a larger truth about the alleged conspiracy. The plan, if it existed as more than talk, depended on public rupture. It needed London to become unpredictable at the right moment. It needed ceremony to fail. It needed people in the streets to behave not as spectators, but as participants in a sudden political crisis. None of that happened. The city watched. The king passed. Parliament opened. The empire's ritual machinery continued to function, even while the empire itself was beginning to break apart across the Atlantic. There is something almost eerie in that contrast. In America, the crisis was becoming a war of armies, declarations, and territorial control. In London, on this day, the crisis had become a war of nerves. Nothing visible occurred, yet the fear of what might occur had already produced a prisoner in the Tower and a debate about liberty at home. So the safe journey did not end the Sayre affair. It removed the one event that might have justified it most dramatically. Without an attack, the government needed evidence. Without evidence, the arrest looked heavier, not lighter. And in the days that followed, the story began to turn against the men who had tried to control it. The king had passed safely through London, but Rochford's own path through the affair was becoming far less secure. The government's case began to lose its shape. That is often how these affairs collapse. Not with a single dramatic confession of error, not with a minister standing before the nation and admitting that fear had outrun proof, but through a series of quieter retreats. A charge softens. A prisoner is moved closer to release. The language becomes less absolute. The machinery that had entered the story with iron confidence starts looking for a way out that does not sound like surrender. Stephen Sayre had been arrested under the shadow of high treason. But high treason is not an accusation that can live forever on atmosphere. It requires more than alarm. It requires evidence capable of surviving scrutiny, and the evidence against Sayre did not seem to grow stronger with time. Richardson's report remained important, but one report, however alarming, was not the same as a proven conspiracy. The search of Sayre's papers had not unveiled the hidden architecture of a plot. The state opening had passed without incident. London had not risen. The Tower had not become a rebel fortress. The king had not been carried off to Hanover. The story that had looked terrifying in anticipation began to look fragile in hindsight, so the charge was reduced. Sayre was eventually released on heavy bail, no small matter in itself, but a considerable retreat from the full thunder of the original accusation. The government had not exactly declared him innocent. Governments rarely enjoy giving their critics such clean victories, but it had failed to produce the kind of corroboration that would make the arrest appear as wise as it had first tried to seem. For Lord Rochford, this was damaging. His decision had placed him at the center of the affair. He had acted as the minister responsible for domestic security, and in one sense that responsibility explains his caution. The alleged threat involved the king. The timing was sensitive. The American crisis had made officials alert to dangers that might once have seemed implausible. No one in Rochford's position would have wanted to be remembered as the man who dismissed a warning and then watched disaster unfold in the streets. But political life is not kind to understandable mistakes, especially not when those mistakes put a man in the tower. Rochford became increasingly isolated. Critics could now argue that he had overreacted, that he had treated a dubious report as the foundation for a spectacular arrest, and that his alarm had handed the opposition a perfect example of ministerial overreach. The affair made him look less like the guardian of order and more like a man caught in the nervous logic of a frightened government. We should be careful here as well. Rochford's later retirement should not be explained by the Sayre affair alone, as if one arrest toppled a minister by itself. Politics is rarely that tidy. Men leave office for clusters of reasons: health, faction, exhaustion, loss of confidence, shifting alliances, accumulated failures. But the Sayre affair contributed to the impression that Rochford's judgment had failed at a conspicuous moment. It weakened him. It gave his enemies material. It made his caution look reckless. That is the irony. He had acted because he feared the consequences of inaction. Yet the action itself became the consequence. And this is where the episode becomes more than a curiosity. It shows the danger of converting suspicion into state power too quickly. Once Rochford authorized the arrest, he committed the government to a version of reality. That Sayre was not merely a talkative radical, but a serious threat to the king and kingdom. Every day afterward demanded evidence strong enough to support that version. When the evidence did not arrive, the government could not simply return to the beginning. Sayre had already been imprisoned. The tower had already been used. The press had already seized the story. Public doubt had already formed. The affair had moved beyond the question of what Sayre might have said and become a question of what ministers were willing to do when afraid. There is a lesson here that reaches beyond 1775. States often want credit for dangers they say they prevented. But prevented dangers are difficult things to prove. They live in the conditional tense. What might have happened? What could have happened? What almost happened? That may be enough in the immediate heat of crisis. It is rarely enough once the doors open, the papers are read, and the public asks to see the substance behind the alarm. Rochford's retreat was not only legal, it was interpretive. The meaning of the affair slipped away from him. At first, he had framed Sayre as a possible traitor. Then critics framed Sayre as a victim of arbitrary power. The government had tried to narrate itself as vigilant. The press increasingly narrated it as frightened. And because the feared plot never materialized in visible form, the government's story became harder and harder to hold. Sayre, for his part, emerged not untouched, but transformed. An accusation of treason leaves a mark even when it fails. It can damage reputation, harden political identity, and push a man further from the world that accused him. If Sayre had once occupied that ambiguous space between American origin, London civic life, and radical politics, the tower helped clarify the break. The British state had treated him as dangerous. It would not be surprising if he came to accept that opposition to that state was no longer merely an argument, but a destiny. That may be one of the unintended effects of overreach. A government, in trying to expose enemies, can sometimes help create them. By the time the case faded, the American war had not faded with it. The empire's crisis continued to deepen. Across the Atlantic, the rebellion was moving toward independence. In Britain, ministers still faced the impossible task of defeating colonial resistance while preserving the appearance of constitutional steadiness at home. The Sayre affair left behind no captured king, no proven revolutionary cell, no decisive legal reckoning. What it left was something quieter and more corrosive, the image of a government that had looked into London and seen treason too quickly. And Lord Rochford, who had opened the gates of the Tower in the name of security, found that the gates did not close neatly behind the prisoner. They closed, in part, on his own authority. After the Tower, Stephen Sayre did not become easier to categorize. That may be the most fitting continuation of his story. Some people pass through a political scandal and spend the rest of their lives trying to recover respectability. They lower their voices. They avoid dangerous company. They learn the gentle art of becoming boring. Sayre did not seem built for that kind of retreat. The affair had marked him. However thin the government's case had been, however damaging the public mockery became for Rochford, Sayre had still been arrested, searched, accused, and imprisoned under one of the gravest suspicions the British state could pronounce. A man does not simply step out of the Tower and resume his old life as if he has misplaced an umbrella. The British capital had become, for him, less a place of opportunity than a place of warning. So Sayre's life moved outward again, away from London and into the wider revolutionary world that Britain feared he had already been serving. He left England. He became involved with American diplomatic activity in Europe. He associated with revolutionary causes. He carried with him the reputation of a restless political adventurer, the sort of man who seemed always to appear where empire, rebellion, finance, and intrigue overlapped. There is a temptation to see this later life as proof of the earlier accusation. That would be too simple. A man who later serves revolutionary interests was not necessarily guilty of every revolutionary fantasy once attributed to him. History is full of people who become more radical after being punished as radicals. The order of events matters. The Tower may not have revealed Sayre's destiny. It may have helped push him toward it. This is one of the quieter ironies of repression. A state may act against a man because it suspects where his loyalties are going, and by acting, it helps send him there faster. Sayre's later career belongs to the unsettled geography of the American Revolution, beyond America itself. The war was not fought only on colonial soil. It moved through European courts, ports, banking houses, diplomatic conversations, and the private schemes of men who believed the imperial order was cracking and wanted to be somewhere near the fracture. America needed weapons, recognition, loans, allies, information. Britain needed to prevent those things. Between those needs lived a world of agents, envoys, sympathizers, speculators, and men whose titles were not always as clear as their ambitions. Sayre fit that world rather well. He was not one of the great polished names of the Revolution, the sort carved into national memory with marble certainty. He was more elusive than that. He belonged to the margins where official diplomacy and unofficial action blurred. Such figures are easy to dismiss as secondary, but revolutions often depend on them. They carry letters. They make introductions. They chase money. They stir sympathy. They make promises they may or may not be authorized to make. They live in the uncomfortable space between patriotism and opportunism. Sayre's reputation as an adventurer should not be treated only as an insult. Adventure, in the 18th century political world, could mean courage, improvisation, vanity, risk, or a talent for appearing at the right doorway with the right story. It could also mean unreliability. Men like Sayre could be useful and exasperating in the same month. They could serve a cause sincerely while also serving their own sense of importance. That human mixture is part of what makes him interesting. If we reduce Sayre to either martyr or schemer, we lose the texture of the man. He was not merely the innocent victim of Rochford's panic, nor can he be safely turned into the hidden architect of a plot that the evidence never fully proves. He was something more plausible, a politically charged, ambitious American moving through a revolutionary age, vulnerable to suspicion because he really did live near the edges of power. The Sayre affair followed him because it captured that ambiguity in one violent flash. For his enemies, the arrest confirmed what they wanted to believe, that Sayre had always been dangerous, always connected to radical designs, always too close to treason for comfort. For his defenders, the collapse of the case confirmed the opposite, that the British government, desperate and fearful, had used him as a target because he was American, outspoken, and inconvenient. Both versions contain something emotionally satisfying. Neither is complete. What we can say with more confidence is that Sayre's later life shows how porous the revolutionary Atlantic had become. London, Paris, Amsterdam, and other European centers were not separate stages from the war in America. They were part of the same conflict, connected by correspondence, credit, rumor, and diplomacy. Men who seemed peripheral in one city could become useful in another. A suspect in London could become an agent elsewhere. A scandal in Britain could become a credential among Britain's enemies. Sayre understood, perhaps instinctively, that the American Revolution was not just a military struggle. It was a struggle over legitimacy. Who had the right to speak for liberty? Who could claim constitutional principle? Who could persuade foreign powers that the rebellion was not a disorderly tantrum, but a cause worthy of support? That battle required men who could speak the language of politics across borders. Sayre had spent years in the imperial world. He knew its manners, its weaknesses, and its appetite for intrigue. His very ambiguity, so dangerous in London, may have made him useful in Europe. Still, there is something lonely in his story. The famous founders entered history through declarations, congresses, armies, portraits, and carefully preserved papers. Sayre entered through a panic. His name survives most vividly because the British government once believed he might be involved in a plan to seize the king. That is a strange kind of immortality, to be remembered less for what you proved than for what others feared you might do. Yet perhaps that is appropriate. Sayre belonged to a revolutionary world built partly out of fear. Fear of tyranny, fear of rebellion, fear of mobs, fear of ministers, fear of empire, fear of collapse. His life after the Tower did not resolve those fears. It carried them into new settings, across borders, through the restless networks of a war that kept expanding beyond the battlefield. He left the Tower behind, but he did not leave behind the age that had put him there. And in that sense, Stephen Sayre's later life is not an epilogue to the affair. It is evidence of the larger condition the affair exposed, an empire so deeply entangled with its colonies that even exile, diplomacy, and suspicion became part of the same long unraveling. Britain was fighting a rebellion across the Atlantic. But the Sayre affair revealed something more intimate and more unsettling. The empire was also looking inward. That is the part of the story that gives it its lasting charge. On paper, the American crisis was a colonial problem. It concerned assemblies, governors, taxes, troops, ports, and the authority of Parliament over distant provinces. The map seemed to make the conflict manageable. Britain was here. America was there. Ships crossed between them, Orders moved outward. Reports came back. But empires are not held together by maps alone. They are held together by people, habits, money, letters, loyalties, friendships, careers, and assumptions about who belongs where. And by 1775, those connections had become difficult to trust. The very networks that once made the empire strong now made it nervous. An American merchant in London might be a loyal subject, or a sympathizer, or a courier, or simply a man trying not to be ruined by events larger than himself. A radical politician might be defending ancient English liberties, or encouraging colonial rebellion, or merely enjoying the sound of his own opposition. A crowd might be a crowd, or it might be the beginning of a mob. A rumor might be nonsense, or it might be the first visible trace of something real. The Sayre affair exposed this problem brutally. It showed that Britain's rulers were not only worried about armies in Massachusetts. They were worried about interpretation. They had to interpret faces, conversations, associations, silences. They had to decide whether the capital's ordinary political life was still ordinary, or whether rebellion had entered it under familiar names. That is a dangerous mental condition for a state. When fear turns inward, it rarely stops at the obvious enemy. It begins to examine the ambiguous person, the inconvenient speaker, the man with foreign connections, the club that meets too often, the newspaper that laughs too sharply. Suspicion spreads not because everyone is guilty, but because uncertainty itself starts to feel like guilt waiting to be discovered. In London, that uncertainty had many forms. There was fear of Americans, because American identity had become politically charged. There was fear of radicals, because British radicalism gave colonial complaints a domestic echo. There was fear of mobs, because London crowds had already shown they could make authority look fragile. There was fear of rumor, because rumor moved faster than official correction. And there was fear of invisible networks of loyalty, the kind no proclamation could easily define and no soldier could easily arrest. This is why the alleged plot against George III, however improbable in its mechanics, was so powerful as an expression of anxiety. It gathered all those fears into one scene. The king in his coach, the city watching, an American radical nearby, the Tower waiting, the crowd imagined as a force that might suddenly choose the wrong side. It was less a practical blueprint than a nightmare drawn in political symbols. And nightmares matter in history, not because they show what is real, but because they show what a society believes could become real. The British government's reaction tells us that the American Revolution had already damaged more than imperial authority abroad. It had damaged confidence at home. It made ministers wonder whether loyalty could still be assumed in the capital. It made critics wonder whether liberty could survive the government's fear. It made Americans in London into figures of suspicion, even when their actual intentions varied widely. That is the deeper importance of the affair. It was not a decisive event in the military history of the Revolution. It did not change the course of a campaign. It did not produce a treaty, a battle, or a constitutional settlement. In a traditional history of the war, it might appear as a footnote, if it appears at all. But footnotes are sometimes where a system reveals its nerves. The Sayre affair shows the British Empire at a moment when it could no longer clearly separate external rebellion from internal dissent. The categories had begun to blur. An American grievance could sound like an English radical argument. A British defense of liberty could be read as sympathy for rebellion. A demand for security could resemble arbitrary power. Every side accused the other of betraying the Constitution, and each meant something slightly different by the word. That confusion was not accidental. It was built into the imperial crisis itself. The American colonists had long claimed the rights of English subjects. British radicals had long criticized ministerial corruption and the overreach of authority. When the imperial quarrel became war, those languages did not politely separate. They collided. They echoed. They made London feel less like the command center of empire and more like one of its contested spaces. This is what Rochford and his colleagues were sensing, even if they expressed it through the blunt instrument of arrest. They were sensing that rebellion was not merely a geographic event. It was an interpretive one. It changed what words meant. It changed what associations suggested. It changed how the state listened. And when a state begins listening for treason everywhere, it may hear treason even in the wrong places. That does not make the fear entirely fake. It makes it historically serious. Britain was facing a real crisis. The American rebellion would not vanish. Foreign powers were watching. Domestic critics were active. The imperial structure was under pressure from several directions at once. But seriousness does not guarantee wisdom. The Sayre affair reminds us that governments in crisis often confuse intensity with accuracy. Because a fear is urgent, they assume it is well-founded. Because a suspect is plausible, they assume he is dangerous. Because a rumor fits the mood of the moment, they assume it fits the facts. And yet, facts are stubborn things. They ask for evidence even when the atmosphere is thick with alarm. By the time the affair began to fade, Britain had learned very little that was concrete about a conspiracy. But it had revealed a great deal about itself. It had shown how quickly the capital could become a theater of suspicion. It had shown how easily an American presence in London could be recast as an internal threat. It had shown how the war for empire abroad could provoke a struggle over rights and power at home. Most of all, it showed that the British state, for all its confidence, was not immune to fear. It could be startled. It could be embarrassed. It could look at its own streets and wonder whether the enemy was already there, not marching in uniform, but speaking quietly at a table, carrying letters, knowing the right names, and waiting for the right moment. That image may have been exaggerated, but the fear behind it was real. And in the autumn of 1775, as Britain tried to hold an empire together, that fear briefly turned the road to Parliament into a mirror. And what the government saw reflected there was not strength, but vulnerability. So we return, at last, to the question the affair never quite lets us answer cleanly. Was George III truly in danger? Not in the satisfying way a courtroom drama would prefer. The evidence does not allow us to say, with confidence, that a disciplined revolutionary conspiracy stood ready in London to stop the royal coach, seize the king, command the Tower, control the arsenal, and transform the city into the stage of a political coup. The mechanics are too improbable. The corroboration is too weak. The surviving shape of the accusation rests too heavily on reported conversation, official alarm, and the nervous imagination of wartime government. But saying the plot was unproven is not the same as saying the story was meaningless. The real mystery is not only whether Sayre planned the impossible, it is why the British state believed the impossible might be close enough to require action. That belief is the key. In October 1775, Britain was no longer dealing with a colonial complaint that could be filed away in dispatch boxes and debated at leisure. The imperial crisis had become violent. Rebellion had been proclaimed. Americans in London were no longer simply colonial subjects abroad. They were people whose loyalties might be examined. Radicals were no longer merely noisy critics. They might be seen as domestic echoes of a rebellion overseas. Coffeehouse talk was no longer merely talk. In the right mouth, heard by the right listener, it might become a warning. The Sayre affair survived because it sits at the point where fact and fear begin to contaminate each other. There were facts. Stephen Sayre existed. He was American-born. He had radical associations. He held a place in London civic life. He was accused, arrested, searched, and imprisoned. Richardson reported an alarming conversation. Rochford acted on it. The state opening passed safely. The case weakened. There were also fears. Fear that London might not be loyal enough. Fear that the American conflict had already crossed the ocean. Fear that public ceremony could become public humiliation. Fear that crowds might choose spectacle over obedience. Fear that the language of liberty, spoken too loudly and by the wrong people, might become a weapon against the state. The danger was not just that ministers believed a rumor. The danger was that the rumor fit the world they had begun to imagine. That is why this strange episode matters. It shows us a revolution traveling by means other than armies. It traveled through letters, loyalties, arguments, friendships, accusations, and the hardening instinct to suspect. It moved through the minds of people who feared it, sometimes as powerfully as through the actions of those who supported it. Revolutions do not only overthrow governments. Sometimes they make governments reveal themselves. The Sayre affair revealed a Britain that was outwardly imperial and inwardly anxious. A Britain that could still send soldiers across the Atlantic, but could not fully trust the streets around its own king. A Britain that spoke the language of order, yet feared the disorder hidden inside conversation. A Britain defending constitutional authority abroad while being accused of violating liberty at home. And Stephen Sayre, whatever he truly said in that coffeehouse, became the figure through whom all of those tensions briefly passed. He was not important because he almost captured a king. We cannot honestly say that he did. He was important because the government feared he might belong to a world in which such a thing could be imagined. That is often where secret histories live, not in what can be proved beyond all doubt, but in what powerful people feared enough to act upon. In the end, George III rode safely to Parliament. The Tower did not become the center of an uprising. The alleged plot dissolved into uncertainty, ridicule, bail, and political damage. The empire continued its war, and the larger revolution moved on toward consequences far beyond one London arrest. But for a brief moment, the British capital looked at an American in its midst and saw the outline of treason. Perhaps it saw too much. Perhaps it saw what the age had taught it to see, and that is the unresolved truth of the Sayre affair. The king may never have been close to capture, but the British government was already captive to a deeper fear. That rebellion was not safely across the Atlantic, not confined to colonial roads and distant battlefields, but present in London itself, passing from mouth to mouth, table to table, rumor to rumor, until even the road to Parliament seemed uncertain. History does not always turn on what happens. Sometimes it turns on what people believe is about to happen. And in the autumn of 1775, that belief was enough to open the gates of the Tower.